I was about to say
This
that.
meeting is being recorded.
I always forget. So I'll start again. Welcome everyone to our third Virginia Voices with co-host Cathy Hailey, Vice President of the Northern Region of PSV, and myself, VP of the Western Region. As many of you know, Poetry Society of Virginia has launched its Centennial Celebration, which will culminate in our annual statewide festival in May of 2023. The Centennial Committee settled on a theme for our year-long celebration, Virginia Voices, 100 Years and Beyond. Cathy and I started this series in order to get to know our members better by hearing their poetry, finding out what they enjoy about PSV and what their hopes are for it as our community moves into its next century. On the second Wednesday of every month from now until May 2023, we will gather to ask our guests the same three questions. And I am so excited to be on this adventure. We've heard some similar answers. I've heard answers I haven't thought of yet. And I felt inspired, challenged, and completely reminded of why I joined PSV to begin with. Both Bill Glose and Kathleen Decker have been generous enough to post recordings of the episodes on their PSV YouTube channels. And Cathy will put the links to those just so that if you can't be here, but you want to see what someone said, you can. This hour is going to go really fast, so we better get started. Today, Cathy and I could not be more excited to welcome poets Joanna Lee and Dr. Steve Bucher. Joanna Lee is the author of the chapbook Dissections, co-editor of the anthology Lingering in the Margins, and founder of the Richmond, Virginia community River City Poets. Her work has been published in Rattle, Parhelion, Driftwood, and elsewhere, and has been nominated for both a Pushcart and multiple Best of the Net prizes. Dr. Steve Bucher lives and writes poetry in the Virginia Piedmont. He's an active member of the Poetry Society of Virginia. His first collection of poetry, We Stay, A Brief Telling, Such a Poet's Line, I love that title, was published in February 2021 by Propertius Press. His poetry appears in Blue Heron Review, the Journal of Inventive Literature, the California Quarterly, Glass, Facets of Poetry, and the Weight of My Heart anthology. Steve received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto and has most recently been teaching English language arts in Fauquier County, Virginia. Welcome. Audience members, we want to encourage you to use all the ways Zoom provides to interact with our guests today, although you may want to mute so that the sound is really good as people are sharing their poetry. But please use the reactions at the bottom. Please use the chat. We've got Karen Stewart in the audience, so that chat is going to be going off. Use your snaps in your Zoom square. Use your claps. You know, us poets, we cannot get enough of that. We love some praise. So we will get started today where PSV started with a poem. Joanna, Vice President of PSV's Central Region, will you please share a poem first?
Would love to.
Thank you.
This poem is one that I wrote for Tupelo Press's 30 for 30 project, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But it's called To the Daughter I'll Never Have. There were days I never thought of you. Whole stretches of hours I was happy, finite. Weeks I got lost just living. When I was your age, I never thought in terms of legacy. And now, what kind of world would I leave as legacy for you? There were other days, are other days still, when I miss the tininess of your hands, get so angry I could punch the wall thinking I'll never have the chance to hold you for the first time. When I get lost and wondering if you would have more red in your hair than I do, or the same crippling shyness. I don't know if introversion is something inherited, but baby girl, I would hope you're not a talker who doesn't use her head. I would hope you're smart and sensitive, things any mother might wish. but also ones I might have had hope of passing on to you. Just as I would hope that decades from now, maybe we might sit as women do and laugh over a glass of wine, maybe on the moon if there's nothing left for us here. But don't grow up in a hurry. Someone will always want something from you. Know its value before you give it. Study your blue book before you name its price. I want to tell you to take the curves slow, but my opinions won't fit on the dash. And without the thrill, there's no point in the sports car anyway. Without comparisons, we'd have no scale with which to weigh ourselves out, hand ourselves to another, sell ourselves to the world. I never saw you made to be for sale. Your hips and everything that pulses between them belong to you and you alone. There are whole universes in the dark cave of your blood. Call them forth if you want. Tuck them under your tongue on lonely days and whistle the rain away. I could never whistle. We always want better for our children. I miss you. Miss like hell the star-charted possibility of you. Buy the sports car, darling. Find a desert road and drive through midnight. Just you and the sky.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Wow, Joanna, I've only been able to see Joanna in board meetings, and I have been missing out to not know your poetry, to hear so much hope and yet a grief at the same time. It was absolutely riveting, and I'm very grateful that you wrote it and that you brought it here today. Thank you. Steve, thank you. Would you share?
Thanks, Angela. Yes, so I'm going to read the opening poem from my book, We Stay a Brief Telling. The book itself is it's a celebration of season, very much in a Vivaldi-esque kind of way, but rather than, as Vivaldi begins with the kind of allegro moments of spring, I begin with the more adagio moments of November and December, moments of withdrawal. And this first poem is called November Moment. It offers an invitation to the reader, really a challenge, to stand naked at the edge of the more difficult moments of life, the transition moments in life, like November itself, a moment that is no longer caught in the flush of October or yet touched by the hard freeze of winter, moments that offer nothing but themselves. So again, this is called November Moment. Stand naked at the edge, even if only for a little while. Find that November moment with its crow calling echoes across blanched fields and husk dry whispers through branch and stalk and shadows grown long and deep in the waning sun. Stand naked at the edge and seek out leafless moments, even in summer fullness, offering nothing but themselves. Invitation indelible to stand exactly where you are, homeless, along your silent edges, at home at last, where you are least secure. Stand naked at the edge. Then seat yourself at the table laid and feast upon the harvest found. In this November moment, even the brown-backed and weathered acorn will take firm root.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. I love that your poem is in conversation to me with Joanna's, and perhaps that's what all poems do. They ride this edge between things.
Oh, you know, when you set this up, because I've never met Joanna, and so I wanted to learn about her. So I started going in and reading her poetry, and I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, this is a great pairing.
Mm-hmm. And we can already tell that, and that has happened with the previous two shows too. And it's magical and not intentional at all, because Cathy and I, neither one are that disciplined, I don't think. So we're going to go to our first question. Steve, will you share your personal approach to poetry?
Sure. So why do I write? Because there are some experiences that you have in life that are so intense that they demand we speak to them. My style, as you could tell from the first poem that I read, is very distilled, kind of minimal, and also a bit lyric in a traditional way. I love delving into the etymology of words and drawing upon that kind of richness of history that our words have. I love allusions to things like figures of mythology, so that I can tap into that kind of cultural reservoir of thought and drama that we all have and we all know, and you can just tap on it by making allusions to it that can enrich what you're saying in an oblique way. And I also like to, and this is also reflected in the first poem I read, to give very fierce attentiveness to nature, reflecting on particularly where I live, on the topography and the seasonality of this Piedmont area of Virginia. And to do it in a way that kind of reflects lyrically on the topography and seasonality of the soul, or of however you want to refer to the spiritual dimension of what we are. So I tend to view my poetry as an invitation to the reader, an invitation to enter into dialogue with me, which is interesting that you picked up on that kind of engagement into conversation in the first two poems. Being a very distilled writer, I write suggestively, allowing a many layered interpretive approach for the reader. My intent in this is that my reader's own valid interpretation becomes equal to my own. And this is what I try to preach to my students in class, that when I write a poem, of course, I have a very distinct idea or feeling that I want to get across. I have a very clear intent. However, once I'm done with it, once I put it out there, then the reader's interpretation, if they can support it, is equally as valid as my own. And that at that point, we enter into a conversation of interpretation. And I try to structure the poems in a way that a reader can go back to them and read it and reread it and get something different every time because of that layered structure that I give to my poetry. And to convey that you can read this at a different time of day and get a different reading from it. You can read it at a different time of the year. You can read it at a different time of your life. And ideally, if I've done my job, you will get something different every time. And that's how the conversation persists. For me, the poem should give the reader something new to think about on each reading, and to bring something new to the poem from themselves with each reading. This is a very good message to give my students, because unlike math or science, where there is always a right or wrong answer, we can talk about poetry, and I can say, hey, give me your interpretation. If you can support it, it's just as valid as mine or anybody else's. So it's something that most students don't understand about poetry. They tend to defer from commenting on poetry because, this is something I don't understand, as opposed to getting that freedom of, hey, there's not a wrong answer here. Let yourself go into it, sink into it, and see what you think. And then try to support why you're thinking what you're thinking. So that's my general approach to poetry. In terms of other poetic projects that I'm working on at the moment, I do have a second collection of poetry with my publisher that I've tentatively called COVID Chronicles, Poetry in the Time of Pandemic. And it sort of carries me from January of 2020 to January of 2021. And it reflects on the themes of like unknown threat, vulnerability, risk, also considering what was going on during the year, outrage, protest. and maybe a generational chance to rethink the norm. So I'm pretty happy with that. That was such an intense year to go through. And I was like, when I say there are some periods of your life that are so intense that you have to speak to them. And this was certainly one of them. I am also working on I'd like to write a really long poem. Like, we get so caught into when you're submitting for publication, should be no more than 1 page. And I started thinking of, I want to buy a painting to fit the size of my couch. And I would really just like to write a very long poem, and maybe something like a poetic memoir, and see where I can go with that. But those are kind of some of the things that I'm working on right now.
Thank you, Steve. I couldn't help but think that when you mentioned a light touch, an illusion, that is one of the ways that you draw people in and make space for people. And you do that so well. Thank you.
That's a great way of putting it, making space for people.
Yeah.
That's like a comfort zone of interpretation. I love that.
Yeah, you should check out the chat, because you've got some people talking over here. They're loving it. There's not a wrong answer here aspect of poetry. You should check that out.
Oh yeah.
See what you've got going. Joanna, what's your personal approach to poetry?
Well, first of all, I love Steve. I love what you were saying about no wrong answer and open to interpretations. The idea of writing a poem with a particular message in mind, but leaving it open to discussion, to create a dialogue with the reader or the listener, is something that I also really endorse and believe in. When I'm writing, I certainly do have a purpose and a message I want to say, but I think one of the beautiful things about a poem is that the gifts it gives by bringing back to you interpretations that you never considered from your readers, and just creating these bridges, these dialogues, bridging these perspectives. And to me, that is like the magic of a poem, is how it can create these conversations and become like a dance that just evolves and takes you someplace that, although you began with this initial intention, you're going to end up where you never thought you would be. And that's, for me, when I write, I do try to have that intention, but I love the open-endedness, and that's something I always keep in mind when I'm writing. And I've written poetry since I was very, very young, and it's something, no matter what period of my life I've been in, what I've been doing or studying or working on elsewise, it's something I've always come back to and needed to come back to. It's been just an integral part of my way of interaction and to approach the world and see the world and process the world, trauma and otherwise. So I love the idea of your COVID collection. And I think there's been so many books that have been written during this period, because there's been so much unrest and so much unease, and there's so much to process, that poetry as therapy is sort of that's an overused term, but as a way to process and a way to create some perspective and some distance from the intensity of the feeling that we're all experiencing these days with the state of the world for one reason or another. That's a critical thing. And that's what poetry does really for me. It takes the intensity of what I'm experiencing, and I'm able to create a little bit of space and a little bit of distance, and to see it as something that's art. And it's the creating of that space that allows me to really gain some healing or some measure of peace. So it's really integral to how I deal with the world. And I once had someone from a critique group describe what I write, in general, my tone, I guess, is a wistful bitter. And I think, that was many, many years ago, and I think it's still valid, that there's a hopefulness to what I write. It tends to be light and lyric, but there's also a sadness to it. And I think that reflects just my experiences. I tend to write poems that are image rich and that also can be read on multiple levels. with that same idea of interpretation, going from one image or one metaphor to the next, and finding something deeper that you can dig into after a first reading, so that you can approach it at different seasons of life, seasons of whatever. I love that too, Steve. So I'm with you there. As far as projects right now, I mentioned the Tupelo Press. I've written with them 2 years now, doing the 30 for 30 project, where I write for 30 days straight and they publish it the next day. So it's a hard deadline, knowing that what you're creating is going to be seen by eyes the next day, which gives a whole new level of the sort of immediacy of getting pen to paper and getting something down and making sure it's not complete crap, right? So I mean, you can go back and edit later, but there's still this level that you need to maintain. And it's a fundraiser for the press. They do amazing work. And if any of you are deadline driven, like I tend to be, I think it's a great way to get involved with them and do good work and get inspired. I like the daily challenge of having to do something. So I did that this year in January, I did it last year in February. And then I haven't done a whole lot of writing since then. I've been pieces here and there, but mostly editing and putting together trying to put together a collection. I have been given a deadline by some folks here in our organization to try to get together a full length book. And I've got a few ideas that I hope to see come together by the end of this summer. So that is my goal currently, is to get a book length something together in the next couple months.
Do it. Now you have one more person holding you to that deadline. That is a collection I want to read. I need to read. I know it. There is so much in what you both said, but and I don't want to talk too much, but Joanna, what you're talking about taking the intensity down a notch and being able to reckon with that and turn it into a piece of art. It was much more eloquently said when you said it, but that really spoke to me. But even hearing y'all talk about your poetry, like, it's bringing tears to my eyes, and I'm like, and it's so nice to hear how even your approaches, like even your poetics, are in conversation with each other and with other people in this room. I see people nodding and going into the chat, and I just, it's really beautiful, and it's exactly what we wanted. I'm just very moved. We are going to go straight into the next question before we get to hear another poem. So Joanna, we'll start with you on this question. What prompted you to join Poetry Society of Virginia, and how has PSV made a difference to you?
So this was sort of a trick question for me, because I actually became a member on one day. I was asked to be the VP of the Central Region, and I became involved because here in the Central Region, we had not had a whole lot of representation for a number of years. And I felt like I wanted to be part of this larger body and just become more involved personally, and for the people that I know immediately who are poets here in Richmond. And it's been challenging, I think, to try to create those inroads, but I see like events like this Zoom has been amazing since the pandemic hit. Who knew how much different something as tragic as that could make conversations and the ability to connect with people that are not immediately, in your, I would never be able to go out to where you are, Angie, or I can't get to some of these events in other places around the state, but just being able to do these video meetings has helped a lot. And just to see different ways, like all the perspectives that we gain by getting to know each other and putting together the meetings and the events that we do here in Richmond and elsewhere. I've met some amazing people, and I'm always just floored at the wealth of talent that there is, that we have here in Virginia. And also the openness and the willingness to give of people of their time and their energy to make those connections and to share their gifts. And it's been the biggest blessing, I guess, to find more of those people. And you don't realize how many poets are out there, and until you ask. And if you put the call out there, they will answer, is what I found. And I had a community here in Richmond, the River City Poets. We've been together now for a decade, and we're an organization that doesn't have like a 501c3 or anything like that. We're just an open community, but having a little bit of structure of some of the PSV events that can dovetail into some of the things that we do has been a great experience, an exchange of ideas and people, and just again, pooling of talents and energies, and it's been beautiful to see. So
yeah.
did I answer?
Yeah, beautiful answer. It was perfect, and has been my experience, and absolutely, and to see, and that's why I think even doing this is so important, because I'm seeing some repetition of names who I wouldn't have known were members because I can't get to their region. That's what I was going to say. There was your wistful bitterness right there. Out of COVID, we got Zoom, and now we can be a community. Yeah.
So
it was a perfect answer. Steve, how about you? How'd you get here, and what's it been for you?
Yeah, that is such a great question, because I come new to this game. I have only been writing for maybe 14 or 15 years now. I had always wanted to write. I did creative writing in high school and college, and always had it as something that I wanted to do. But then after you graduate, you kind of get caught up in the stuff of life and grad school and career, and everything else that you wanted to do kind of gets pushed to the back. And so I worked for the federal government for 30 years. I retired as a senior executive back in 2012. But a little bit before then, as I was getting to the end of my career, I started thinking again about wanting to write. And so I was living by myself at the time, or at least by myself and 6 dachshunds. And I would just take time to sit out. I live in a very, very rural area and have always, but I would just go out and sit in like a grassy area or a wooded area by myself for hours at a time. And I would watch like the late afternoon turn into twilight and then into deep night. And I would just try to really open myself to, what am I experiencing here? And get involved with the intensity of it. And the more I did this, and I did this for a long time, lines of something would start coming into my head, like almost involuntarily, just lines of narrative would start coming into my head. So I started taking out a journal with me. And as I was like having these moments, or like taking walks through the area and trying to really focus attentively on what's around me, I would start just writing down the lines that would be coming into my head. And while I said I had always wanted to write, I had thought that I wanted to be a writer of maybe intellectually challenging detective novels. I found that what was actually coming out was poetry. So I started to actually craft my writing into what I could consider a poem, and eventually had something that I thought looked like a poem, but how was I to know? I didn't know any other poets. I never took a class in writing poetry. I didn't know whether it was worth pursuing what I was doing. So I started just going online. How can I find out about poetry writing groups? And I got pointed in the direction of the Poetry Society of Virginia. I joined up with the Poetry Society of Virginia, and then inquired of the person who was, I guess, in charge at the time about, do you know of any local poetry groups in my area? And he referred me to then Northern Vice President Barry Amos, who had a once a month Sunday poetry salon. And maybe 10 to 12 people would come and read poetry that they were working on and give each other constructive and very collegial feedback. It was a great group. So I began attending that regularly and getting comments on my poetry, suggestions that were offered. But the best thing about it was helping me to craft my own voice, like pointing me toward, hey, you say this here, when you go into this stanza, you've lost your voice here. And that was such a great thing for me to become aware of, is like how to hone your poetic voice. And the group that Barry had put together there was wonderful for that. So for me, the Poetry Society of Virginia has made all the difference in the world, because at least as a poet, by offering this kind of, and you refer to it as a community, but by offering this kind of collegial community of support that helped me shape my craft as I have it today and continues to do that. So I think it's a really wonderful nexus of great people with great thinking and great articulation.
Yeah, I think there's some really great articulators here today, as a matter of fact. You and Joanna are doing that so well, like defining community and defining community for poets. And I feel like other people in the room may be feeling this too, but as you talk about your poetics, or as you talk about your experience with community, I'm feeling validated. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I am on the right journey, and I'm feeling not alone. I'm feeling paired up, and I'm feeling connected, and it's just really beautiful. Y'all are still living with 6. Is that how many? Is it still 6, Lisa? And when you first said that 6 dachshunds, I was like, it took me a minute, and then I just died. You didn't? Okay.
Oh,
yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. I died laughing. That was hilarious. And then I had to get back to being serious. Okay. So before we go on to our last question, we get to hear 2 more poems. So Steve, you've got the mic. Why don't you start for us?
Sure. So while I started with the introductory poem for the book in November, I'm going to go to the middle of the book, and I have 3 summer solstice poems in the middle. I love writing about the solstice. One is about the length of day. One is about the kind of twilight moment of solstice. And the third is about solstice night, the shortest night of the year. So, as the year in poetry turns from winter back into rebirth, and life again begins to flower, the days grow longer, but also the nights get increasingly short, but increasingly intense, filled with fireflies, spring peepers. It's just an intensity of orchestra. The poem that I'm going to read is called We Seek As If to Stay. And it's sort of talking about that shortest night as a way of engaging it, where you are trying to get it to stay with you. Okay, as if to stay. Beloved brevity before dawn, your bewitching lights and choral thrum offer hearth and haven. Solstice flashing fireflies dance treetops and leaves. Spring peepers sound and stretch this shortest night. Summer rain draws slow to drops upon my brow, and I draw slow to footing long misplaced. Safe astride the swell of rising dance and spell, this paling night a provenance of purchase brief. Unburdened of the stones I've laid, dry stone walls that mark the years beyond my waiting feet. Unburdened of weight and grief unbidden. My pilgrim heart in this place blessed. Held fast in fear and flame, held fast as if this night to stay. Like tears of men and gods unwept.
You've long surpassed those days of your voice not being in the next line. right?
Thank you.
You inhabit every one of your poems. I've only heard 2 of them, but I know, and I feel like I could read a poem and know this is by Steve Bucher. He wrote this. Yeah, what a powerful voice you have. Joanna, will you lead us into the next question with the poem?
Sure. So this next poem is, I did a project earlier this summer. I really do work well to deadlines. So this was another project that where I was working with the Land Conservancy here locally, the Capital Region Land Conservancy, and I was given a particular piece of land to write for, and to create 3 poems and 1 video poem for this particular piece of land in Richmond. It's by the James River, and it's got a lot of history to it. And I spent a lot of time there. I wasn't going to read this, but then Steve was talking about how he started writing with the land, and I was like, I want to read my land poem. And this is my favorite of the three poems that I wrote, and it is a Haibun for an island that is no longer an island. There are many paths down to the water. On spring days like this one, even the sky drips, whispering the greens of summer into wet existence. What were you called before you were weighted with the hardness of hewn stone? Was it a summer name, fluid, draped with a skin of stars? Was it made of all a river can know of language, words for every shade of life that tiptoes roots into the cradle of her bed? Did you sing back with the joy of your silences, the flutter and crawl and stamp of time? On spring days like this, did you share a tongue, the tug of warm mud where one nature holds the hand of another, passing secrets in the slow burst of a bead of honeysuckle? The river hums a different song now, maybe, colder, more lonely. She has seen more sadness lapping at your edges than even the rain can wash clean. Maybe you remember. Maybe you have taught yourself to choose to forget. To us who never learned to shape our ears around the syllables of earth and current, or to dance in the rhythms that lie outside of rhythm, there is only mystery and regret. And yet there is laughter in the sinking of graffitied cement into your riots of vine, bright colors swallowing bright colors until wild strawberries cover all, your heart closing like a fist content. If we who are deaf to such things could translate the crank of the heron overhead, it might say, let go. Foam swirls from cold pipe and smiles and snake-like knowing as it becomes still.
When you write alone, sometimes you start to wonder why you write. But then when you hear poems like we're hearing today, and you hear poets speak of poetry like we're listening to today, you remember why you write, and you feel valuable again, and you cannot wait to get back to the pen and the paper. Thank y'all for that. And then may y'all make sure you're looking in the chat if you're not, because people are commenting, people are moved, and I don't want you to miss out on knowing that. So I got so into the poems, I forgot what my next question is, and it's the same one every time. Okay, so we're celebrating the centennial, and one of the things we talked a lot about in our board meetings, it was, what our theme's going to be, and that was Virginia Voices, and then we talked a lot about, well, how do we want to set up a festival or a year that moves us into the next century? And so that's where this question was born. And there are a million different ways to answer it, all of them right. But Joanna, as PSV moves onto the timeline or through the timeline of the next 100 years, are there moments or events or ideas that you're hoping to see happen?
I mean, I see the PSV as ever evolving, and I think we've already started making some really nice steps toward things I'd like to see happen, like an impetus to really get younger poets involved and do some events that will draw them in and really take in the next generation. I think that's a huge thing and a big focus that already we're starting to move toward, Cathy, and some of the initiatives that you guys have already started with more in-person like competitions, video competitions, more focusing on the oral nature of poetry, I think, than some of the written exercises. I think has been already some great steps forward toward that and getting the younger generation involved. To take it even to the next step, maybe have a larger social media engagement and connect with some of the younger folks on the other platform, Instagram and TikTok, and they're really foreign, I think, for a lot of us. But I think poetry needs, as a vehicle, needs to evolve, and we as a community spreading poetry, we need to evolve in some of the same vehicles. And I see that as a possible direction for us to move as we transition. I think the next 100 years. I mean, it's 100 years seems like such a long time, but these things are small steps that we're making, day by day and month by month. And I really like the direction that we're headed in now, especially engaging with the young and also being more connected over as a state overall. In the past, our big event has been the annual contest, and then the festival. And then other than that, things have been sort of separate, and each region is left to their own devices. And there is some degree of connectivity and overlap. But again, with the evolution of the technology and video communications, we're starting to see this movement where we can all be together and really broaden our scope and our net and our reach. And I would love to see that continue as well. Again, I think we're going in the right track. Sort of other wish projects that I would love to see, and we're already starting to see the roots of take place are engaging with other arts, ekphrastic exercises, say, working with musicians and artists of other genres to really connect and not harness, but I guess take to the next level the power that poetry has to just create these conversations where we began this conversation an hour with ago. So yeah, that's. I mean, I'm doing all the right things.
Thank you. That was very inspiring for me to hear. That is where you're sitting with it and seeing that, and because I do sit in those meetings where we're talking about these things and what are we going to do and what and that kind of conversation can sometimes just be fraught in some way, and so sometimes I leave and don't maybe know if we're doing that, but to hear you say all of that, I'm like, wait, we are getting there, we are going where, and so it felt really good to hear you say that. And I just wanted to do a really quick plug for Cathy's, because this is right, exactly what you're saying. She has started this show that she's doing where art meets the line. And so she should probably put a PDF or a Zoom link or something in it. We should let all of y'all know it is an amazing show that, again, spans the state. And you get to see people whose poetry you may know and their art. and hear about the conversation that they see between the two. That's right, Karen Stewart. You want to see that. Karen Stewart needs to be on that show. But okay, so Steve, you're our last answer to our last question, and before we get to close with 2 poems, what do you hope to see?
So what I alluded to earlier about the really great work that I thought Louisa Gloria was doing with the young poets in the community, that is the kind of thing we need to be doing. We need to be engaging young people, getting students involved in their communities through poetry, because most young people, like especially middle school kids, high school kids, feel very marginalized in their communities. They feel like outsiders, and they feel the dysfunction of their communities, but don't know how to deal with it. And we had some really great work done by these kids who were using poetry to engage the marginalized people in their own communities, and to bring things together. I think public education, for the most part, badly serves students with respect to poetry. And it's through nobody's particular fault. But for example, before I started teaching, I was going to my daughter's parent-teacher night at 7th grade, and we were going from teacher to teacher, and we got to her English teacher. And I was just asking her, so what do you plan on doing this year? And she was going through the authors, and then she said poetry. And I said, hey, well, actually, I am a published poet. And her eyes just got really big, and she said, oh, poetry is my weakest subject. Would you be willing to come and do my poetry sections for me? And I said, of course. And I did that and loved it, and remembered immediately why I had always wanted to be a teacher. But I think that's not far off the mark for a lot of teachers, is that they kind of don't know what to do with poetry other than to teach it as, oh, here are rhyme schemes, here is how you structure a sonnet, here are the forms of figurative language that we use in poetry. And we lose students with that, rather than getting them into the passion of poetry. When I was teaching my 12th graders this year, we ended up doing the Romantic poets of the 19th century. Of course, that's where I wanted to end up. But at the end of the year, I asked my students, because it was the first time I had been teaching high schoolers, I was saying, hey, so what worked for you this year and what didn't? And everybody came up with poetry. They loved the poetry section because they had always just viewed poetry as kind of a lame collection of obscure lines that sometimes rhyme. And this one girl then, after saying that to me, she said, but when you gave us and she quoted this verbatim, when you gave us Wordsworth's definition of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, she said, that opened a whole world to me. The whole view of the Romantic poets opened up a dimension of poetry that I had never been exposed to, and that I never realized it as a vehicle for the powerful expression of emotion. And so I think whatever we can do as an organization to kindle the minds of young people towards poetry in a constructive way, and to show them how they can use poetry to speak to the marginalized elements of their own lives and the marginalized lives of those in their communities, would be wonderful. To show kids that they can affect change. They actually can affect change through poetry. And if we enable them, then all we need to do is get out of the way and let them do it. And I think initiatives like we did with the young poets in the community is a very important thing that we have done and that we should continue to do.
It's just another intersection between you and Joanna, that this is one of y'all's passions to see. And it was PSV and being the VP that gave me kind of the title to be able to go into schools, because it's kind of weird if you just walk up, I guess, as a stranger with no children and volunteer at schools. But when you can go and say, I'm the VP of the Western region, I'd like to do a poetry club for your 5th grade, and then to watch these students and what they create. And this one little 5th grader said to me, as I was going around the room and I got to his poem and he said, it started off funny and then it got real. And I thought, that's poetry. Yes. And to see the students who created this really powerful work. I mean, fifth graders writing this moving, provocative work, like you're talking about the marginalization that they're experiencing and finding a way to articulate it and express it. And then when the club time would be over, the teachers would often say, I can't believe he or she did that. They never do schoolwork. They don't like academics. They don't like reading and writing. But that's not even necessarily poetry, is it? Poetry is its own animal. So I'm so excited that we are going to leave today by hearing one more poem from each of you. I'm also excited to know that you both each have a collection that will be coming out. And so we'll get to experience more of you in that way too. So be sure you let us know when that happens. Steve, since you are unmuted, will you read your last poem for us?
Sure. And this is the last poem of the book, and it's the last stanza of this poem is where I take the title to the book, We Stay a Brief Telling. It's called Autumn Bonfire. And so beginning with November and December and moments of withdrawal, I end up with September and October, harvest months. And at the time that I wrote this, my family and I were living on a small horse farm, and I had retired from my work, and my life was cycled around the effects of seasonality on horses and wildlife, and taking care of horses during periods of seasonality and their maintenance and their safety. And part of this seasonality would be you get to the end of the year and you collect a very large, all the slough of the year, the fallen limbs, the leaves, and you create this huge bonfire, and then you sit around and enjoy the bonfire. And this particular October day, which was a very warm day, I got the fire lit. My wife and kids were sitting around, and we were like roasting hot dogs and making s'mores and telling stories about the year just to kind of collect it. And as the sun set and the wind picked up, the evening started to get chilly. Everyone retreated back into the house, but somebody has to actually watch the fire until it goes down. So we sat, so as I went back to the house at one point to get a drink of water, and as I was walking back up to the fire, I noticed that as I was walking, there was like this darker shadow walking next to me, and it was my barn cat, Pippin. And so my barn cat follows me up to the fire and then spends the rest of the night there just sitting next to me. We were both watching the glowing coals way past midnight. And Pippin was lying at my feet, sort of staring at the coals and like twitching his tail. And I suppose that if I had been a cat, I would have been twitching my tail as well. But as we were sitting there, I composed this poem as kind of the culmination of the seasonal cycle that I'd been going through in the book. And again, it's called Autumn Bonfire. It begins with four sets of couplets. Fall flame burns blush to ember. Winter-bitten limbs drop to ash. Day's west wind dies fast to frost. Star-stretched night grows conscience clear. A darker night than cast to ground lies at my feet. His feline beacons blaze on glowing coals. Alike in hour and twitching tail, we find fiery solitude in tolling night. The new moon sinks late beneath the trees as kindred thoughts convene in quiet covenant. We stay a brief telling at fire's edge, tenebrous, but for the bones we burn at season's end. And when I was talking about etymology, I had gotten up to the last stanza and I really didn't know how to end this poem. And I thought, let me look up the origin of the word bonfire. And it comes from like late 14th, early 15th century English, and the original term was bonfire, where a collection of bones would be used to start and fuel the fire. Particularly at a time of maybe plague, when there might or battles, there may have been large collections of bones, and they used the bones to fuel the fire. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a wonderful image that at the end of one cycle of life, you burn the bones of that cycle and you move on to the next one.
Yeah. And that love of etymology is, I guess, what has fueled your ability to language our natural world into like an emotional and visceral experience for the reader. Yeah, it's incredible. Thank you, Steve. Joanna, you're going to send us home.
All right. So I chose something that's maybe one of my more hopeful and less bitter poems, I think. This is another one of the poems from the Tupelo 30 for 30. This was a poem I wrote last year. And I'm taking on sort of we've all heard about, everyone's tried to write a love poem, and everyone, why do people write poems? To woo women, Robin Williams said, right? So I figured I'd take a spin on that and see where it went. And it's kind of fun. So this is how to write a love poem. First, study tango and some sort of Eastern martial art like jujitsu. Climb an impressive mountain, maybe Fuji or Everest. Commit the view at the summit to memory. Pay attention to foreign languages, how the syllables lead one into another. Pick up at least 3 and practice conversing casually at swanky dinner parties. Study calligraphy and yoga. Learn how to box. Spend free hours at the local animal shelter, just watching the doors swing open and close. Take your first attempts at a love poem and fold them into 1,000 origami swans to swim in your love's kitchen sink. When the ink dries, leave the words to speak for themselves and take up metaphysics. The beauty of the equations will eventually become too much like Dante's Paradise. Then start with the physical attribute and work your way inward, letting muscle fibers give way to the bones that cage us, to the heart that keeps the only rhythm worth knowing by heart. Remember, no roses, nothing red. Ignore the flashing lights outside. You know where this is headed. Your second attempt at a love poem should include specific constellations and some oblique reference to the infiniteness of the ocean. It might smell like rust. That's the blood in it. A real love poem is never sterile and usually a mess on Sunday mornings. It should be barefoot. It likely will sing badly and want more from you than you're comfortable giving. Give it. Tattoo it on your palms and place them on your love's cheekbones, then hips. While the ink dries, kiss them again and in every language, like a battle, like a god, like a puppy who's just found home.
What? You are a brave poet, both in the places you're willing to go and in the way you're willing to play. And what comes out of that is just tremendous. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you. If everyone wants to unmute and give a clap, give some snaps, give some hoot and hollers, or we can do that, right? Unmute.
Whoop, whoop. Wow. Wow.
All I
Wow.
can say is I am overwhelmed, absolutely overwhelmed by both, by everybody, and the chat.
Me too, Nancy. Me too. Thank y'all so much for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hopefully we'll see y'all next month. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's been amazing. Wouldn't have been the same without
you,
any
Angie.
of you. Thank you.
Save the chat so you'll have some of the links too.
Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby.
Welcome.
Good to see you, Steve.
Good to see you.
It was good for me to see you too, Linda.
I'm glad you're able to join us.
Yeah.
You guys have really created something special with this, I think. You should be really proud.
Thank
Hey.
you, Joanna. But you two made it extra special. I mean, we've been very